Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're heading back, way back, to a time of crisis, a date that resonates with this sense of, well, collapse, 1177 BC. For historians, it's not just a year. It's more like ground zero for this huge, pivotal moment when the world, the ancient interconnected world, just seemed to unravel. And the big question, the one we're tackling today, is how? How could these powerful, seemingly stable civilizations all linked together just fall apart so dramatically?
It's a massive question, and that's exactly what we're diving into. We want to explore that really complex picture. We'll be looking at the events, yes, but also the people involved, the environmental shifts, all these threads that kind of converged around that time. Think of it like putting together a huge historical puzzle. The clues are everywhere, ancient inscriptions, things like the Papyrus Harris, which is this incredible Egyptian record, or the
Yeah.
carvings at Medinet Habu. Amazing detail there. Then you have the immortal letters, basically, like diplomatic emails on clay tablets, kings writing back and forth.
Right, gossiping even sometimes.
Exactly. Complaints, requests for gold, you name it. And of course, there's tons of archaeological evidence, actual stuff dug out of the ground. Plus, we now have modern science helping us look at ancient climate data, seismic activity, things like that. But this isn't just, an academic puzzle. Looking at 1177 BC, it shows how even sophisticated, globalized societies can be incredibly fragile. It's a bit of a wake-up call, maybe, for our own interconnected world.
That's a really powerful way to put it. So, okay, let's set the scene. We invite you, our listener, to join us as we unpack all the layers of this fascinating, sometimes troubling historical mystery. We're heading back to a world that feels, in some ways, strangely familiar in its complexity, but also deeply alien in how it ended. Section 1, the Golden Age of Interconnectedness, the Late Bronze Age world. Right, so before we get to the collapse, we need to understand what was actually lost. Let's talk about the Late Bronze Age itself, roughly, 1550 to 1200 BCE?
That's the time frame, yeah. And it's crucial to get this. This wasn't just a few isolated kingdoms bumping into each other occasionally. This was really a period of unprecedented international connection. A truly globalized ancient world, you could say.
Globalized? How wide are we talking?
Think geographically vast. From modern Italy stretching all the way east to Afghanistan, and from Turkey, Anatolia, down south to Egypt. It's a huge area, a really vibrant network trade, diplomacy, culture swapping back and forth. It was sophisticated.
Okay, so who are the main players in this globalized world?
Oh, you had the heavy hitters of the era, the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece, Agamemnon's people, if you like. The Minoans on Crete before them, really masters of the sea. The Hittites, a major empire up in Anatolia, modern Turkey, they were rivals with Egypt. Then further east in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, Syria, you had powers like the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Mitanni kingdom. Cyprus was hugely important, a major source of copper. The Canaanites in the Levant acting as crucial middlemen. And of course, Egypt, often the anchor, the superpower at the heart of much of this network.
And we know they were connected because lots of traded goods found everywhere.
Overwhelmingly so. The archaeology is just full of it. We find Egyptian stuff, scarabs, fancy pottery, metalwork all over the age, and vice versa. You find distinctive Minoan and Mycenaean pottery turning up in Egypt, Syria, all over the Near East. It's not accidental. It's systemic trade.
So it's not just finding a pot here or a statue there. Is there more dynamic evidence, like evidence of the trade actually happening?
Absolutely. And maybe the most vivid evidence comes from shipwrecks. They're like perfect time capsules.
Yeah.
The Uluburun shipwreck found off Turkey is incredible. Sank around 1300 BCE.
What was on it?
Oh, everything. An unbelievable snapshot of Bronze Age trade. Over 10 tons of copper ingots. Almost a ton of tin ingots essential for making bronze, plus pottery from all over, luxury goods like ivory tusks, hippo teeth, beautiful glass ingots, resins, spices, and even personal items belonging to the crew. Tools, weapons, jewelry, weights, seals. It gives you a real sense of the people on board. And the ship itself, made of Lebanese cedar. The anchors were stone, typical of the Syro-Canaanite coast. A lot of the personal items point that way, too.
So likely a crew from the Levant.
Very likely, yeah. Maybe sailing out of a port like Ugarit. This one ship just perfectly illustrates how interconnected these kingdoms were. It was like a floating marketplace.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit further. That's an incredible picture, but how did they manage it all? Across different cultures, languages, huge distances. What were the mechanisms behind this network?
Yeah, it wasn't random. It was surprisingly organized. You can think of it as a kind of integrated supply chain, maybe several tiers. It was built around trading crucial raw materials. These were the absolute foundation of their economies, their technology.
Like the copper and tin for bronze.
Exactly. Copper mostly from Cyprus. But tin was the tricky one. Much rarer.
Where'd they get tin from?
A lot of it remarkably, seems to have come all the way from Afghanistan, the Badakhshan region.
Afghanistan? That's thousands of miles away.
It is. Imagine the logistics. Getting that tin overland, probably through trading hubs like Mari on the Euphrates or Ugarit on the coast, just to get it to Mediterranean workshops. Besides bronze metals, you had gold, mostly from Egypt, silver from Anatolia, those glass ingots we mentioned, probably from Egypt or the Levant. Both essentials and luxuries moving constantly.
And it wasn't just stuff moving, right? There were official communications.
Absolute critical. We found thousands of clay tablets archives, basically,
Yeah.
from places like Amarna in Egypt to the Hittite capital Hattusa, Ugarit again. These tablets have everything. Formal treaties between the great kings, detailed trade contracts listing goods, prices, everything. And those Amarna letters, they're the most personal. Over 350 letters, mostly pharaohs talking to other kings or vassal rulers in Canaan.
So like ancient emails, you said.
Pretty much. Asking for gold, lots of requests for gold, complaining about gifts, arranging marriages, discussing military matters, sometimes just friendly greetings. It shows they had a shared diplomatic language. Akkadian cuneiform was the lingua franca, the common tongue for diplomacy, and shared rules of engagement, a common understanding of international relations. It was a whole system.
It sounds incredibly cosmopolitan. What about the Mycenaeans? We tend to think of them as maybe more Greek, Asian-focused. How did they fit into this bigger Near Eastern picture?
Well, initially, the big sea power in the Asian was Minoan Crete. They sort of set the stage. But around the mid-15th century BCE, the Mycenaeans effectively took over Crete. That was a huge shift. And they didn't just stay there. They actively took over the existing international trade routes that the Minoans had pioneered, connecting the Aegean with Egypt and the Near East.
So they became major players on the world stage.
Absolutely. They muscled their way in and became key players. And we see this reflected in Egyptian records, which is fascinating. Take the statue bases of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, early 14th century BC. They have these lists inscribed on them, basically listing important places known to Egypt. And suddenly, you get names never mentioned before in Egypt places to the west. Names like Mycenae itself, Naupli, Knossos, and Kydonia on Crete, Kythera Island.
Wow, specific city names.
Exactly. And then separately, almost like regional labels, you get Keftiu, generally thought to mean Crete or the Minoan world, and Tanaja, which most likely refers to mainland Greece, the Mycenaeans. It shows the Egyptians weren't just vaguely aware of these people, they were interacting with them, recognizing them as significant political and economic entities. It points to that deep integration.
Section 2, the cataclysm, unraveling the threads of civilization. Okay, so we have this picture of a thriving, interconnected world, which makes what happens next, around 1177 BC, all the more shocking. It's this date, this moment, this turning point, where so much of that world just seems to grind to a halt.
It is shocking, a profound disruption. You have these large empires, smaller kingdoms built up over centuries with complex government economies, and they collapse, some of them incredibly quickly. We're talking Mycenaeans, their palaces burn, Minoans fade. The Hittite Empire essentially vanishes from history for centuries. Assyrians, Babylonians, Mitannians, they all face major upheaval. Cyprus, its copper trade disrupted, Canaanite cities destroyed. Even Egypt, mighty Egypt, though it doesn't fully collapse, it's severely weakened, loses its empire in the Levant, pulls back into its borders, a huge contraction.
And it wasn't just one thing, right? You mentioned the Sea Peoples, but it sounds like more was going on.
Exactly. It's crucial to understand it probably wasn't just the Sea Peoples. Most scholars now think it was more like a perfect storm, a whole series of different pressures, human and natural, hitting at roughly the same time. A cascade of failures.
A domino effect.
Precisely. Because these civilizations were so interconnected, the collapse of one, maybe due to drought or earthquake, puts immense strain on its trading partners. Disrupt the trade routes, the supply chains, and suddenly other kingdoms are vulnerable. It creates this cascading collapse across the whole system.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. This perfect storm idea. What were the key ingredients? What were these multiple stressors that all came together?
Researchers have identified several main candidates, all likely playing a role, maybe interacting with each other. First, major climate change specifically. Prolonged, severe drought across the region. This hits the agricultural base, the foundation of everything. Second, earthquakes. Not just isolated tremors, but possibly earthquake storms, periods of intense seismic activity. Third, internal factors, rebellions, social unrest. As things get tough, societies can turn inward. And fourth, yes, those external pressures, the invasions and migrations of groups like the Sea Peoples.
And the argument is maybe they could have handled one of these.
That's the key insight, I think. A society might weather a bad drought, or rebuild after an earthquake, or fight off one group of invaders. But facing all of them, or several of them, in rapid succession, That's what seems to have overwhelmed them. The combined effect was just too much. The system broke.
2.2, environmental trauma, drought and famine. Okay, let's start with the environment. What's the actual evidence for these severe droughts? How do we know the climate turned against them so drastically?
The evidence is pretty strong now, and it comes from multiple scientific fields. It's not just one study. Scientists look at ancient pollen grains trapped in lake sediments. Changes in pollen tell you about changes in vegetation, which reflects rainfall.
Okay.
They analyze the layers in those lake sediments themselves, showing water level changes. They study stalagmites in caves. The chemistry of their growth rings changes with rainfall. They take core samples from lagoons. And all these different lines of evidence are pointing to the same thing. A major, long-lasting drought hitting the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean starting around 1200 BC.
Not just a dry year or two.
No, we're talking potentially decades, maybe even centuries in some areas. Some studies suggest up to 300 years of significantly drier conditions across a huge area, from Italy to Iran. A real mega drought.
And we can see this year by year.
Remarkably, yes, through tree rings dendrochronology. Tree rings are like nature's archive. Wider rings mean good growing conditions, plenty of water. Narrow rings mean stress, often drought. And the tree ring data for Anatolia, for instance, shows this pattern really clearly in the years leading up to 1200 BCE. You see this continuous decrease in the growth index, meaning drier and drier years right in the final decade or so before the Hittite Empire collapses. Just a couple of slightly better years break the pattern, but the trend is sharply downwards.
Wow, so a persistent, intensifying drought.
Exactly. And for societies based on rain-fed agriculture, which many of these were, that's catastrophic. It means widespread crop failure.
So the direct human consequences must have been immense. Famine, disease. What does the record tell us about how people suffered?
Utterly devastating. Widespread famine is explicitly mentioned in texts that survived, and famine inevitably leads to malnutrition, which makes people vulnerable to disease. So yes, disease outbreaks likely followed. We have these heartbreaking letters, one sent from Emar, a city in Syria, pleading for help from Ugarit on the coast. It says, there is famine in our house. We will all die of hunger. If you do not quickly arrive here, we ourselves will die of hunger. You will not see a living soul from your land.
Chilling. Just absolute desperation.
It really is. And a Hittite king, facing similar shortages, sent a desperate message asking for grain shipments, saying simply, it is a matter of life or death. It shows how systemic the crisis was.
Did anyone try to help? Did those international connections mean anything when things got this bad?
They did, to some extent. We know the Egyptians, even while facing their own problems, sent grain ships to help the starving Hittites in Anatolia and people in northern Syria. There are records of this found at Ugarit and Hattusa. There's also archaeological evidence suggesting the Egyptians were trying to adapt crossbreeding cattle and crops in the Levant, possibly trying to develop more drought-resistant strains.
So they were aware and trying to respond.
It seems so. It shows the interconnectedness was still there, even in crisis. But apparently it wasn't enough. The scale of the drought, the famine, it just seems to have overwhelmed these efforts. As the records suggest, it was too little, too late.
2.3 geological turmoil, earthquake storms. So the climate turns hostile, harvests fail, people starve. But you also mentioned earthquakes. Was the ground itself becoming unstable? What are these earthquake storms?
Yes, that's another major factor, potentially working in tandem with the drought. An earthquake storm isn't just one big quake. It's a theory supported by geological evidence that suggests periods where you get a whole series of major earthquakes happening in relatively quick succession, maybe over decades, along connected fault lines.
Like seismic dominoes?
Kind of, yeah. One large earthquake can increase stress on other parts of the fault system, potentially triggering more quakes. Geophysicists like Amos Nur have looked at the patterns. They've mapped the major fault lines in the Eastern Mediterranean, the ones active today, and overlaid the sites that show destruction layers around 1200 BC.
And there's a correlation.
A strong correlation. Many of the destroyed cities lie right along these major fault zones. It suggests a period of intense, widespread seismic activity across the region.
That's terrifying. Can we actually see the human cost in the archaeology? Are there finds that show people caught in these events?
Tragically, yes. The archaeology provides some incredibly grim, direct evidence. At Mycenae, for example, excavators found skeletons, 3 adults, a child crushed in the basement of a house by fallen stones. Not abandonment, but sudden death.
Oh, wow.
Another find there. A woman crushed in a doorway, maybe trying to escape. At Tiryns, another big Mycenaean center, more skeletons found buried under collapsed walls near the fortifications. And at nearby Media, the skeleton of a young girl, her skull smashed by falling stones near one of the gates.
Just off of frozen moments of disaster.
Exactly. And while some scholars in the past were maybe skeptical about earthquakes being a primary cause, arguing damage could be localized.
Right.
The work by Nur and others, looking at the pattern of destruction across the whole region, makes a much stronger case. The sheer number of major sites showing violent destruction consistent with earthquakes, combined with these human remains, points to seismic activity being a really significant factor in the collapse.
2.4, the silent killer. Disease and epidemics. Drought, famine, earthquakes. It's a grim picture already. But what about disease? We often forget about epidemics and ancient collapses. Did they play a role here too?
It's a very strong possibility, though harder to prove definitively from the archaeological record than, say, a burnt layer or a collapsed wall. Disease often thrives in precisely these conditions. Populations weakened by famine, displaced people migrating and crowding together, breakdown of sanitation. It could absolutely have been a major factor, weakening societies, reducing manpower for farming and defense, maybe even acting as a push factor, forcing people to leave affected areas.
Are there any specific diseases scholars suspect might have been involved?
There are a few hypotheses, some more speculative than others. One intriguing idea involves tularemia, or rabbit fever. A molecular biologist, Sir Trevisan, proposed this. He suggested it might have caused the big Hittite plague back in the 14th century BCE, and maybe even the biblical plague of the Philistines.
How would that work? Germ warfare, even.
Trevisan suggests the Hittites might have used it deliberately, but it could also spread naturally. It's carried by rodents and insects. The biblical account mentions rodents afflicting the Philistines alongside the plague, and this mysterious box or ark associated with the disease spread. Trevisan argues this could fit with tularemia, perhaps if the box contained infected material or vectors like mice. It's debated, but interesting.
Okay, what else?
Smallpox is another strong candidate, a devastating killer throughout history. There's a peculiar case with Pharaoh Ramesses V, who reigned around this time. He died, but wasn't buried for 2 years. The usual process was about 70 days.
2 years. Why?
We don't know for sure, but it's highly unusual. Maybe his body was so ravaged by disease it needed extra work. Maybe the embalmers were scared of catching something highly contagious.
Or maybe there just weren't enough embalmers or tomb cutters available because an epidemic had killed many of them.
Exactly. That's another possibility. And the fact his successor, Ramesses VI, ended up being buried in the same tomb adds to the sense of crisis and disruption. Smallpox could certainly cause that level of mortality and chaos.
And just general background diseases.
Right. We shouldn't forget things like malaria, which was endemic in the region, especially in marshy areas and along the Nile. Always a killer, especially certain strains. And measles. Maybe less deadly than smallpox usually, but in a population already weakened by hunger and stress, it could become a major epidemic, hitting children especially hard. So while we lack smoking gun proof for a single massive pandemic right at 1200 BC, the conditions were absolutely ripe for infectious diseases to flourish and contribute significantly to the weakening and collapse of these societies.
Section 3. The enigma of the Sea Peoples. Okay, let's turn to the group that often gets blamed for everything, the infamous Sea Peoples. Who exactly were these mysterious invaders that appear so dramatically in the Egyptian records?
All right, the Sea Peoples. It's a term modern scholars use based on Egyptian descriptions of various groups who attacked Egypt and other areas by land and sea around this time. Our best views of them come from those amazing reliefs at Medinet Habu, Ramses III's temple. They show battles, prisoners.
And they look different from each other, right?
Exactly. You see different kinds of helmets, some feathered, some horned, different shields, kilts, weapons. It strongly suggests this wasn't one single people, but a coalition, a confederacy, diverse groups, probably from different places, different cultures, maybe banding together for raiding and migration. The Egyptian texts give us names for some of them. The Paliset often identified the Philistines, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Danuna, the Washesh. These names pop up in inscriptions from both Merneptah and Ramesses III.
So a diverse coalition, where did they actually come from? And were they really the primary cause of all this destruction, or is the story more complicated?
That's the million-dollar question. Their origins are still debated, but the consensus is they likely came from various places around the Mediterranean. Some probably from the Aegean region, maybe parts of Greece or the islands. Some possibly from Anatolia. Some have even suggested links as far west as Sicily or Sardinia for groups like the Shekelesh or Shirden.
So not just one place.
Definitely not. Which complicates the simple barbarian invasion narrative. And increasingly, scholars are leaning towards a more nuanced view. that these sea peoples might have been as much victims as aggressors.
Victims? How so?
Well, think about the conditions we just discussed. Drought, famine, earthquakes, destabilizing their own homelands wherever they were.
Mm.
It's plausible they were forced out, displaced, and became migrants looking for new homes and resources. Migrating often involved conflict, of course, so they might have arrived on the shores of Egypt or the Levant already desperate and attacked kingdoms that were already weakened by these other factors. Opportunistic, perhaps, rather than the sole cause.
That makes sense. Taking advantage of chaos.
Exactly. And there's that intriguing idea linking them to the Trojan War period. The traditional dates for Troy's destruction overlap with the Sea People's main activity. Could some have been refugees from that whole chaotic situation in the Aegean and Western Anatolia? It's speculative, but fits the timeline.
3.2 interactions and resettlements beyond simple invasion. It's fascinating to think of them as potentially displaced people. So how do they interact with the big powers before everything fell apart? Were they always enemies?
No, not at all. And this is really important. Earlier on, some of these same groups actually show up as mercenaries, fighting for the major powers. The classic example is the Battle of Kadesh, around 1280 BCE, between Egypt and the Hittites. Ramesses II had Shurden warriors in his army, even in his bodyguard. They're depicted quite clearly with their horned helmets.
Fighting for Egypt.
Yes. And on the Hittite side, you had the Luca, another group later associated with the Sea Peoples. So these groups were known quantities. They were part of the military landscape, hired soldiers, sometimes integrated into the system long before the collapse. We even have letters from rulers of smaller cities, like Byblos, complaining about troublesome Shurden mercenaries causing problems locally. They were around.
Okay, so they were known, sometimes hired guns, but then things obviously changed. Their attacks became much more destructive later on.
Absolutely. Towards the end of the 13th century and into the 12th, the dynamic shifts dramatically. They launch large-scale attacks. Cyprus gets hit hard, coastal raids, destruction of key sites like Enkomi, which had strong Mycenaean connections. They attack the Hittite Empire, contributing to its weakening and eventual fall. They sweep down the coast of the Levant, burning cities, disrupting trade. Ugarit is famously destroyed, likely by a Sea Peoples group, and then they make their big push towards Egypt, first against Fermerneptah around 1208 BC, and then a larger invasion against Ramesses III around 1177 BC.
But Egypt managed to fight them off.
Yes, that's key. Both Merneptah and Ramesses III claim major victories, repelling the invasions in the Nile Delta region. The reliefs at Medinet Habu depict Ramesses III's victory in graphic detail. It shows that while the Sea Peoples were a formidable force, capable of destroying kingdoms, they weren't invincible. A well-organized state like Egypt, even if stressed, could still defend itself, though it came at a cost. Egypt survived, but was weakened and lost its external empire.
So what happened to these Sea Peoples groups after their campaigns, especially after being defeated by Egypt? Did they just vanish, or did they settle down somewhere?
Many of them did settle, and they left a very clear mark, especially one group, the Peliset.
The Philistines.
Exactly. The Peliset are almost universally identified with the biblical Philistines. After their defeat by Ramesses III, groups of them seem to have been settled, perhaps initially under Egyptian control, along the southern coastal plain of Canaan. This area becomes known as Philistia. They established major cities there: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gaza, Gath, the famous Philistine Pentapolis.
And we see their culture in the archaeology.
Oh, definitely. Their pottery is distinctively different from the local Canaanite styles, with strong connections to Aegean, Mycenaean, and Cypriot traditions. Their architecture sometimes includes non-local features like hearth sanctuaries. Even their diet seems different, more pig bones found in their settlements compared to Canaanite sites. It signals a real cultural shift, an introduction of foreign elements.
But was it always a violent takeover when they settled? Or more complex?
It's likely more complex than just smashing everything and moving in. Some scholars, like Asaf Yasser Orlando, point out nuances. At Ashkelon, for instance, it looks like the first Philistine settlers might have moved into an area that was already abandoned or only sparsely occupied, possibly building on the ruins of an Egyptian garrison, not necessarily a direct destruction of a thriving Canaanite city right at that moment.
So maybe filling a vacuum.
Possibly, in some cases. At other sites like Ekron, there might have been destruction, but maybe not immediately followed by Philistine settlement. The picture varies from site to site. It's crucial to be careful about attributing every destruction layer around this time solely to the Sea Peoples. As archaeologists often caution, the people who destroy a place aren't always the same ones who resettle it later. So their arrival was transformative, yes, and involved conflict, undoubtedly. But the process of settlement was likely complex, varied, and involved interaction with remaining local populations too.
Section 4. The dynamics of collapse. Systems, economies, and nuance. Okay, so we've looked at drought, earthquakes, disease, invaders, all these individual stressors. But it feels like the sum was greater than the parts. Are we really talking about the entire system breaking down?
That's a really important way to frame it, and yes, many scholars argue that's exactly what happened. The archaeologist Colin Renfrew developed a very influential model of systems collapse that fits this period remarkably well. He identified sort of 4 key features you often see when a complex society collapses systemically.
What are they?
Okay, first, the collapse of the central administrative organization. The palace bureaucracy, the government, record-keeping, it all just stops working. Second, the disappearance of the traditional elite class. The kings, nobles, priests, scribes, they lose power, vanish, or are killed. Third, a collapse of the centralized economy. We saw how dependent they were on trade and palace control that breaks down. And fourth, settlement shifts and population decline. People abandon the big cities, maybe move to smaller villages, or migrate away entirely. Populations often shrink. Renfrew stressed this isn't usually instantaneous. It can take decades, maybe even a century, to fully play out. And importantly, there's rarely a single cause. It's the interaction of multiple factors pushing the system past its tipping point.
And this systems collapse idea isn't just for the Bronze Age, right? It applies elsewhere.
Absolutely. That's what makes it such a powerful analytical tool. It describes what happened in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC very well. But you can see similar patterns in the collapse of the classic Maya civilization, or the end of Egypt's Old Kingdom, or the decline of the Indus Valley civilization. Different times, different places, but similar systemic breakdowns. It really highlights that domino effect we talked about. Because these Bronze Age societies were so interlinked, so globalized in their own way, the failure of one part of the system had massive knock-on effects.
So their interconnectedness, their strength became their weakness?
In the end, yes. When the trade routes were disrupted, when key partners collapsed, the whole interdependent structure became incredibly vulnerable. It's a lesson in systemic risk, really.
4.2, economic interdependence and decentralization. Let's focus on that economic angle. How exactly did that intricate trade network, initially such a source of wealth, become this critical vulnerability?
Well, you get this situation of perhaps overdependence. Christopher Monroe at Cornell has made this argument quite strongly. He suggests that this deep reliance on essentially long-distance trade and a kind of early capitalist enterprise might have made the whole system economically unstable. And here's a key point he makes. The wealthiest cities, the big trading hubs like Ugarit, seem to have been hit the hardest.
Why them specifically? Easier targets.
That might be part of it, sure, they had more loot. But Monroe argues it's also because they were the most dependent on that international trade network. Their entire prosperity was built on importing raw materials, exporting finished goods, facilitating exchange. When that network fractured because of drought, war, collapse elsewhere, their economies were strangled. Itamar Singer basically argued the same for Ugarit. Its lifeblood was international trade. Cut that off, and the city's economy collapses, making it vulnerable to final destruction.
So this catastrophic breakdown of the old centralized way of doing things, did it force a shift? Did a new economic model emerge from the ashes?
It seems like it did, paving the way for the Iron Age economy, which looked quite different. Susan Sherrod at Sheffield has proposed a really interesting idea recently. She sees the Sea Peoples and the whole collapse period, not just as destruction, but as maybe the final step in a transition away from those old, centralized, palace-controlled economies of the Bronze Age.
Towards what?
Towards the more decentralized economic systems we see in the Iron Age. You think smaller city-states, maybe more individual merchants, entrepreneurs acting more independently, less top-down control.
So the palace system kind of contained the seeds of its own destruction.
That's Sherratt's argument, essentially. The very system that created the wealth, relying on these vast, centrally managed networks for specific resources like tin, made it inherently brittle. When those networks broke, or when new groups emerged who could bypass the old system, it collapsed, opening the door for more fragmented, perhaps ultimately more resilient entrepreneurial landscape in the Iron Age. It reframes the Sea Peoples almost as agents of economic change, not just destruction.
4.3, challenging the Great Collapse narrative, false destructions and regional nuance. We often get this image of 1177 BC as this moment where everything, everywhere, just burns. A total simultaneous wipeout.
But you're suggesting the reality is much messier.
Much messier, yes. That narrative of a single universal great collapse is really being challenged by recent more detailed archaeological work. There's been, perhaps, an overemphasis on blaming everything on migrations or invasions and assuming every site met the same fiery end at the same time. If you actually sift through all the archaeological reports from the last century and a half, you find something quite striking. There are about 153 destruction events at 148 different sites that have been traditionally attributed to this collapse period around 1200 BC.
Okay.
But when you look closer, using modern dating and reevaluating the evidence, it turns out that for a huge chunk of those, maybe 94 of them, over 60%, the destruction has either been misstated or it was assumed based on flimsy evidence, or in some cases, it just didn't happen the way we thought.
60%, that's huge. So a lot of the evidence for universal collapse might be wrong.
It suggests we need to be much more cautious. Doesn't mean nothing bad happened, obviously lots did. But it wasn't a uniform blanket of fire across the entire map. It forces us to reconsider which sites really were destroyed violently right at this specific time, and why.
Can you give some examples? Sites once thought destroyed, but now the picture's changed.
Sure. There are quite a few well-known sites on that list now. Places in Greece like Lefkandi or Kamenos, maybe even parts of Athens, Knossos on Crete, in Cyprus, Elassa, across the Levant in Syria. Places like Alaya, Kana, Kadesh, Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Beth Shean. Many of these were once listed as classic examples of late Bronze Age destruction.
But the evidence is now questioned.
In many cases, yes. What looked like destruction might have been later disturbances, earthquakes from different periods, domestic fires, or just misinterpretation. A really stark example is Carchemish on the Euphrates in Syria. Egyptian texts from Ramesses III list Carchemish among the places destroyed by invaders.
Okay, seems clear then.
Except, the archaeology and texts from Carchemish itself tell a totally different story. It wasn't destroyed. In fact, it seems to have thrived after the Hittite Empire collapsed. It survived pretty much intact and became a major Neo-Hittite center in the Iron Age.
Wow. So the official Egyptian account was wrong, or at least exaggerated.
It seems so in that case. It highlights how crucial it is to look at the specific evidence from each site, not just rely on generalized accounts or older interpretations.
So if it wasn't one big uniform collapse, what was the experience across the region? How should we think about it?
We need to think much more locally and regionally. The end of the Late Bronze Age was definitely not a singular event hitting everywhere equally or at the same time. The fates of different places varied enormously. Some cities, like Ugarit and Imar, were utterly destroyed and never really recovered their prominence. They became ruins. Others seem to have simply relocated. The population of Enkomi on Cyprus largely moved to nearby Salamis. Maybe Alak's population shifted to Tel Tainat, adaptation rather than disappearance. And then, as we saw with Carchemish, or Byblos, or Paphos on Cyprus, some significant centers seem to have weathered the storm remarkably well, showing continuity right through this period.
So a patchwork.
Exactly. A complex mosaic of collapse, survival, adaptation, and even opportunity in some places. You have to look at specific places at specific times to understand the different factors at play. Drought here, earthquake there, invasion somewhere else, maybe internal strife somewhere else again. Multiple causes, multiple outcomes. No single narrative fits all.
Section 5. Aftermath, continuity, and lessons for our time. Even with all this chaos and collapse, was anything left? Did any threads of that old Bronze Age world carry through into the Iron Age? Or was it a complete reset?
Not a complete reset, no.
Yeah.
There's actually pretty good evidence for continuity in various ways, suggesting the break wasn't absolute. For instance, international contacts and maybe some level of trade seem to have continued right up until the very end, and perhaps buttered on even slightly beyond in some areas. Look, those last letters found at Ugarit. Written just before the city fell, they still document contact with Cyprus, Egypt, the Hittites, the Aegean. It wasn't a world that had already shut down communications weeks or months earlier.
It sounds like the end came quite suddenly then.
It does seem that way for many places. The system was functioning, maybe stressed, but functioning, and then hit a rapid, catastrophic failure point, rather than slowly fading away into isolation over decades. Diplomatic gifts were still being exchanged shortly before the end.
What about deeper cultural things? Beliefs, rituals, how people live day to day, did those persist?
Yes, significant continuity there too, which suggests that culture resides not just in palaces but in communities. Burial practices, for example. In parts of Greece like the Argolid, traditional family chamber tombs continued to be used for centuries, even as cremation became more common elsewhere. Basic beliefs about death and family seem to have endured. Religious practices show continuity too. Festivals tied to the agricultural cycle, like a festival of the new wine, seem to persist. The idea of hero worship honoring figures from the past, you can trace that from Mycenaean times into later Greek culture. Even specific gods, like Poseidon, maintain their importance.
So the collapse of the states didn't necessarily mean the collapse of culture.
Exactly. Local traditions, community rituals, core beliefs often prove remarkably resilient, surviving even when the political superstructure disappears.
And technology. We always associate this period with the shift from bronze to iron. Was the rise of iron caused by the collapse, or did it just happen afterwards?
That's a really interesting question. The shift to iron was more gradual than sometimes portrayed. The Hittites knew about iron earlier, yes, but mostly used it for prestige items or specific tools, not widespread weapons or everyday implements. The main regional shift towards using iron more broadly for tools and weapons actually happens after the main Bronze Age collapse, in the centuries following 1200 BCE.
So iron didn't cause the collapse.
No, it seems ironworking became widespread because the old Bronze Age system had collapsed. Iron sort of confirmed the end of the Bronze Age. It didn't trigger it. Think of it as a disruptive technology in a different sense. Not because early iron was necessarily better than good bronze, it often wasn't, but because iron ore is much more widely available geographically than tin is.
Ah, so you didn't need those complicated long-distance trade networks anymore.
Precisely. You didn't need tin from Afghanistan controlled by palaces. Local smiths could find and work local iron ore. So the rise of iron reflected and reinforced that shift towards more decentralized economies and smaller political units that characterized the early Iron Age. It democratized metal access, in a way.
5.2 Echoes of History, Lessons for the Present. Okay, stepping back and looking at the big picture. What can we, today, in our own hyperconnected world, learn from the Bronze Age collapse? Are there parallels? Maybe warnings?
The parallels are, well, they're quite sobering when you think about them.
Yeah.
Look at our current situation. We're dealing with the long-term economic and social fallout from a global pandemic. We're facing undeniable accelerating climate change, causing extreme weather, resource stress, potential migrations. We see famine, unfortunately, still widespread in parts of the world, often linked to conflict and environmental factors. We see political instability and internal divisions in many societies.
Sounds familiar.
It does sound eerily similar to that perfect storm of stressors that hit the Bronze Age world, doesn't it? Climate change, resource scarcity, migrations, internal strife, disruptions to global networks. It really forces you to ask, are we potentially facing our own convergence of crises? Is our own complex global system more fragile than we think?
It's a heavy question. So what are the key takeaways then? What should we really keep in mind from this historical episode?
I think there are two main things, maybe one sobering, one slightly more hopeful. The sobering one is pretty blunt. No society is invulnerable. History shows us again and again that complexity and apparent stability don't guarantee permanence. Every complex society eventually faces collapse or radical transformation. The Bronze Age collapse is just a particularly stark example involving multiple interconnected societies failing around the same time. It's a clear warning. It can happen again.
Okay, what's the more hopeful part?
The hopeful part lies in awareness. Unlike the Bronze Age people, who likely experienced these crises, drought, earthquakes, raids as localized or perhaps divinely ordained disasters, without fully grasping the systemic breakdown across their entire world. We can see the bigger picture. We have the science to understand climate change. We have global communication to track pandemics. We have historical analysis, like this, to see the patterns. We understand concepts like systems theory and cascading failure.
So we know what's happening, potentially.
Yes. We are aware, or we can be aware, of the converging pressures in a way they couldn't be. We have the data, the tools, the potential to understand the nonlinear dynamics, the multiple interacting stressors. That awareness gives us the potential to respond more effectively, to adapt, perhaps even to mitigate some of the risks if we choose to use that knowledge wisely. That's the crucial difference.
Which leaves us with a final thought, perhaps. Knowing what happened back then, knowing they face similar complex challenges, and knowing we have so much more data and awareness now, are we actually better equipped to prevent a similar kind of widespread collapse? Or does our modern complexity, our global hyperconnectivity, just create new, maybe even bigger, unforeseen vulnerabilities? Something to definitely think about. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Bronze Age collapse, a truly fascinating period full of mysteries, warnings, and maybe even a little bit of hope and resilience.
It really is. Understanding these major turning points is so important. History doesn't repeat exactly, but the patterns, the dynamics of how complex systems respond to stress, those offer invaluable lessons. Hopefully this encourages everyone listening to keep exploring these connections.
Absolutely. Keep asking questions, keep digging deeper. That's what the deep dive is all about. Thanks for listening.